Hi, welcome to Books in Action. My name is Melissa Kopecky and I am the director of the South Orange Public Library and have a very special guest tonight, also a local, and Meredith Sue Willis is here. She's written so many books and she's written books about writing books, and we're going to have a great conversation. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm happy to be here.
And I just want to jump in right away with your new book, which I have to admit I haven't read, but that's all right because we can talk about it and then it'll make me and you want to read it even more. It's called Their Houses, and I think you did a book talk at Words, nice local book talk. So you want to tell, this is like what, your 10th, 12th,
22nd.
Novel?
It's my 22nd book.
Okay, because you have some collections of short stories.
Okay, you know what? I have not done those numbers. I'd have to subtract.
This isn't a test, don't worry about it. But the bulk of them are novels.
That's right, or short stories, yeah.
So this actually, I really like the cover. It appeals to me. And so you want to tell us a little bit about it, not just the... This is another one set in West Virginia, right?
Half and half.
Oh.
It's a novel that begins in New Jersey without naming the place. It has some young people as children, and they end up as adults in West Virginia, and they're what we call in West Virginia come-heres, which means people who moved in, and so
And does that make you a come-there? Because you started in West Virginia.
I did. I'm a native of West Virginia. I left for college and have never been back to live, although I go back regularly all the time. I was down this fall for a book tour and had such a nice time seeing people and everything. But the novel, most of the big action takes place in West Virginia with flashbacks to when the people were young. And it's a book I worked on a long time and really enjoyed working on and have fun reading from when I go around, and have fun. It's hard to talk about novels, you know.
Yes, right, because you don't want to talk about the plot, and right. But it's not that easy to talk about a collection of short stories, or is it?
No, the truth is I'm not really a heavy plot person. I'm more of a character-driven writer, so it's been one of my efforts has been to figure out how to make interesting plots, because I like to read plots and I like stories, but I always find myself fascinated first by the people, and one of my big approaches to things is imagining what if. So if it's autobiographical, I imagine what if I had gone a different direction. What if I had stayed in West Virginia instead of leaving and ending up in New York City and then, New Jersey? Or the other thing I like to do is try to imagine people who are really unlike me. So one of the main characters in this novel, Their Houses, is a guy who has really not much moral value. He's a pretty rotten sort of person. And I had a good time imagining if there was anything that I could possibly identify with him about, and that was part of the fun.
Well, that's kind of an interesting exercise in this particular point in time, too, because all of a sudden that dichotomy between rural and urban America is so much more, well, some would say divided, than it has been.
Yeah.
And you've always been jumping
back and forth, yeah. And it's true. Most of my current friends in West Virginia and other parts of Appalachia, because I have connections in Kentucky and other places too. Most of them tend to be people associated with colleges, libraries, universities, so they tend to be people who have political views more like mine. But when I go back to my hometown, it's I have to deal with people who are really different. I have an old friend who is a guy who never went to college. He did go to a trade school because he was very good at art, and he learned how to do spray paint cars, and he really made his living doing fancying up cars and motorcycles and stuff like that. And he's an interesting guy because I'm going to write about him someday, I think, too. But he's an interesting guy because he has thought things through for himself, and instead of just doing what everybody around him does, he actually thinks about what he thinks is right. And so he has ended up voting differently. He votes Democratic, and all the people around him vote Republican. But yet he's their best friend. So there's a real kind of a homemade liberal is what this guy is. He created him himself. It's not because of who he hangs out with. He did it himself, and
he doesn't hide it either, huh?
Yeah, no,
so everybody's like, oh, he's just the anomaly.
But everybody, he argues with them, and they just have a happy time. So anyway, I love people that don't quite fit the mold. I love things that are a little, off kilter. One of the pieces of the background in this book, Their Houses, in the mid-90s, there was the then senator. Robert C. Byrd, the famous old senator from West Virginia, got the FBI fingerprinting center moved from Washington, D.C. to Harrison County, West Virginia, which is my home county. And it was a big deal because it was going to be jobs for people. Of course, it took away jobs from people in Washington, but, let that be as it may. So there was a group of right-wingers who decided this fingerprinting center was going to be the center of the New World Order. So this is 1995, 1996. And they made a plot to blow it up before it was actually open. And it was a real comedy of errors because they were buying explosives from some Arab terrorist who was in fact an FBI agent, and it was a real mess, and in fact it fascinated me, and because it was in my home area. So one of my characters was involved in that, not the bad guy, actually a kind of nice guy, got involved in that by mistake. So, but again, that's just that's the kind of stuff. The beauty of a novel is that you can take any kind of material and kind of bring it all together. You can use absolutely anything. I could use your earrings in something, and I could take something, the furniture in this room. You can use everything in a novel, and that's I say that to my students. I had my last novel writing class last night at for the semester at my course I teach at NYU, and I always say that to them, that the beauty of novels is you can use anything because everything's grist for the mill.
And what people have said, right? I mean, do you write down interesting things, phrases that people use or whatever, and
Absolutely.
end up putting them in different people's mouths?
Right. Well, it goes. There are different things you can start with. Objects are good, but certainly what people say, an overheard bit of conversation. I once wrote a short story after a little neighbor girl came over and was watching me, do something in the kitchen, and she started telling me a dream, and she'd had a dream about tiny gorillas running up her arm.
Oh, that's one of your short stories.
Tiny gorillas, and it became one of the stories in one of my books, and it was just a phrase sticks with you, a face sticks with you. Many people, music does it for them, but there's no end to it, and it's not boring. It's always interesting. We were having a conversation earlier about how your work at the South Orange Library is never boring because there's something always going on. And novel writing, the problems with novel writing are you have to sit a lot, and so it's physically debilitating sometimes to sit so long. But the thing itself, the stuff that's going on that you're imagining and remembering and setting up and researching a little bit, it's all interesting. And one of my rules of thumb is that if I'm not interested in it, I have to assume that neither would a reader be, so it gets cut.
Of course, when you get really sucked into something, especially an active creation, I would guess that makes the sitting still worse because you forget you're sitting still forever and then, oops, can't move.
Right, exactly.
At least I know that feeling, but... So I have to say It's very fun. Tiny Gorillas, I have not read a lot of your short stories, and I actually have to say I find it hard to read a collection of short stories, because after I read a short story, I just want to stop. Like, I could never go from one to the next one, because to me, they're more intense than reading a whole book.
Yeah.
And like, how can you just jump to another one? It's like between eating dinner and eating dessert, I always like to take a break in between, you know?
No, I understand. Well, I prefer reading novels to reading short stories myself. I love going into a world. I love the worlds of novels, and I always look at them as like getting into a raft, going down a stream, and you go through sometimes there are trees hanging low, and sometimes it's wide, and sometimes it's fast, and so for me that kind of immersion of a novel is what I like. And my thing with short stories is not so much taking a break for dessert. It's just, if I really like it, I truly don't want it to end. It's not even though it's a beautifully made story with a terrific ending, it never satisfies me.
But you know what it's like when you go to a concert? It drives me nuts that the last note hasn't even faded and people are applauding. That makes me crazy. It's like, let it echo. And that's how I think you have to be with books, whether they're a novel or short story. So if you're letting it echo, so I'll tell you my plan for reading your short stories, because when I saw there's one called Tiny Gorillas, I said, I am reading that because that is just a great title, and now that I've heard the story. But you take them on vacation where you're doing a lot of stuff, and then when you're waiting for people, instead of being irritated that everybody's not ready to go, drive to the next adventure, you pick up a book and read a short story. And then, if they're still not ready, you're getting that, echo time. And then, the next day or the next whenever you have some time, you can read it.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating to hear how you read.
I actually take out books of short stories, and yours will be on my next vacation. It's just been too long.
I like that. I people, of course, their reading habits are changing now because of smartphones, because of e-books, and it's not all for the good. I'm sure we'd agree, but on the other hand, people keep reading. Like my son, who's in his early 30s, and his wife, they read all the time, but they don't buy books. They don't want books around them. They want to read they read on their phones, they read e-books, and so they're reading constantly, but it's not the same experience. And I don't know if they let there be an echo at the end or not.
See, I would have to. I've got no problems with reading on a screen, although I would tend to do shorter stuff that way. But I love being able to carry a bunch of books with me in my pocket. Got no problem with that at all. And actually, I don't mind reading on small screens.
Yeah. Well, I like the Kindle.
Wonderful.
I like the Kindle very much and I actually think that the screen of the Kindle allows you to. I think it's a really ideal place for works that are narrative heavy. So it's great for genre, for mysteries, thrillers, and also great for 19th century novels.
Interesting.
So first of all, as you point out, I always take George Eliot and Jane Austen with me, and Charles Dickens when I go anywhere. But the stories, the one thing after another works really well in that digital format, to my taste.
So we're going to take a break for a minute. And then we're going to come back and talk about the craft of writing and other things.
After 17 years working as a mason, Mike was laid off. I met him when he came into the library looking for help. He found a job opening, but the application was only online. Mike said he'd spent his entire life around tools, but had never used a computer. I showed him how, and he ended up applying for numerous jobs online. I saw Mike the other day. His new computer skills paid off. He's working again.
New Jersey libraries are transforming lives. Tell us your story.
Hi, welcome back to Books in Action. I'm Melissa Kopecky, director of the South Orange Public Library. Our founding genius, Larry Petricaro, couldn't be here tonight, but we're doing fine without him because I've got a wonderful guest, Meredith Sue Willis. So thank you for being with us. We were talking about our newest book called Their Houses, and we were talking about the differences and similarities between West Virginia and New Jersey. And I do want to ask a question about, I think some of your books are obviously very inspired by your growing up in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
But this is actually like a sort of comes out of a family thing, right?
Which one?
The Cole?
The Oradell at Sea?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I held it up.
You meant that particular
say the
book.
name, yes.
Well,
This
yes and
particular
no.
book.
It's always a mix of stuff. And
Okay, yeah, and you were
Oradell at
saying
Sea
that.
is a story about a girl who grows up in the coal camps, and which my parents did. Although the coal camps, this was in the 30s during the Depression, the coal camps were actually very class divided. So one of the things people picture poor, and in the sense that people didn't have much money, they were all poor, but they had very distinct divisions. So there were roads of where the people lived. The company provided the houses, and there was Boss's Row, which had big frame houses and porches, and where the bosses lived. And there was a road for the Americans, which is where my parents lived. And some of them, like my dad's dad was a storekeeper, so they were on the American road. And then there was a road where the immigrant coal miners lived, and that was usually called Mud Street or something like that. And in West Virginia, it was actually Italian Americans who, well, at that point they were Italians, and they became Italian Americans, and they came over in the early 20th century and worked the mines, and became, and so there was this real class difference, and it was frowned upon to date across the lines and everything. So in my story, Oradell is a little girl. When she's a little girl, she is very poor, and her dad's a drunk, and her mother was probably Italian, so they were a cross marriage. And she kind of struggles her way up with some help from people around her. And in her adulthood, marries a guy with some money, so she spends most of her time cruising on ships. So what the story is Oradell cruising and her flashbacks to when she was a girl in the coal camps. And the cruising all comes out of the one time I was on a cruise ship. My husband got a free trip for us. He was going to he had to give a lecture, and by giving one lecture, we got a free cruise. So that was a whole funny thing where we went through the Panama Canal, and it was, very, very vivid experience. And so I mixed that with stories from my childhood about my family who did grow up in these camps.
Oh, that's fascinating. But you never wanted to go on another cruise, or you just...
No, it was not. It was kind of. It wasn't my kind of thing.
Okay. I actually have to say I've never been on one. So.
It was. I mean, it was. There were some wonderful things about it, like the ocean was kind of wonderful. I mean, I had never really been out in the middle of the ocean before, and that was you don't it's big, but you don't really know it's big until you're out in the middle of it and there's nothing around you.
For days and days and days.
There's a big difference, between things we know. We think we know, and when you actually experience them. And so for me, fiction is one of the ways that kind of mediates that. It's one way of bringing experience to people in a way that they might not have gotten it. I mean, I really think that the moral imperative of fiction is to make people understand things and people that they wouldn't have understood otherwise. And I actually think it really is a moral work to do, to write fiction. It's fun too.
Well, that's perfect because you're talking about writing, and you have a number of books that are about writing, of which my favorite title of that is not Tiny Gorillas, but Blazing Pencils, because that's just fun. But yeah, so talk about what made you write your first book about writing, because it's kind of a almost a circle.
Well, I was in the early 1970s. I became a writer in the schools with an organization in New York City called Teachers and Writers Collaborative, which still exists. It's a good organization. It sends writers into schools and also
like
other artists.
Fairly early arts organization, right?
Yeah, it preceded
others.
Many of the others. Yeah, one of the very early ones. And I was not at the inception, but I was pretty early on. So we were always, and they made us diaries. That was one of the requirements, that you kept a diary of your work with children. And then we were asked to turn these into articles. So I was doing a lot of writing from the very beginning about working with kids. And at some point, they had a lot of people writing about poetry, about writing poetry, which was kind of the original thing that the organization did. And people like Ron Padgett and Kenneth Koch were really wonderful poets who worked with kids. But I began to do fiction because that was what I was writing. And they asked me to write something that was about fiction for teachers. So it was an assigned work. I mean, I suppose it was a contract. It was pretty informal, but I was asked to do it. And I used workshops I had done for teachers, because I would occasionally take my ideas to teachers. And it was a very different kind of writing from writing fiction, because when you're in school, they say the way you write is you figure out what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you summarize it, and then you've done it, And actually, that was how these nonfiction books about writing, that's what they were like. I would picture the teachers that I had worked with, or the kids, and I would, say what I wanted to say and write it down. But it's completely different from fiction when you take this face, this voice, this phrase, and see where it takes you. So that they're entirely, I mean, they're both obviously using words, but they're entirely different experiences, and they're both fun to do, but they're very different.
But it's like a double burden writing about writing, because you have to write it really well.
You have to write it. No, I think what you have to do is write
make
it
really readable.
We have to write it very simply.
Okay.
That's what you have to do. You have to write it very clearly. And I constantly, when I'm writing those books, am actually picturing a group of teachers, because that's who they were kind of aimed at, teachers or some writers. And their teachers are a very hard audience. Ask any teacher, when they go to meetings, they're one of the hardest groups to keep interested, because they know what it's like to be up in front of a group, and they're very, kind of cynical about it. So I would picture the teachers, and I would try to figure out how to engage them, make it clear to them, say exactly what I wanted. And I, sometimes I succeeded, and I'm sure sometimes I failed. But the one of those books, though, is the one you like the name of, is actually aimed at kids, Blazing Pencils.
Okay, that would explain why.
That one actually is written to children, so that was a little different.
Okay.
And that was fun. And I've also written 3 children's novels and a couple of young adult novels.
I read Billy at Fish House Lane.
Yes, and that though to me is really just like writing fiction. It's simply, although I have to say my children's books are all first person. I don't always write in first person. So so those books for me are me creating or imagining being a child, a particular child who's different from me, but I have to be in the kid's head, so it's just a matter of imagining what their life is like and what stories they have to tell. So it's very similar.
That's so interesting. And you do that sometimes in adults, but not always. It just is.
That's right, because adult novels I might follow. Well, in their houses, I actually have 6 main characters. Is that right?
Different narrators.
3. Yeah, 6 men, 3 men and 3 women. And so in this case, I'm interested certainly in those 6 people, but also in the permutations of their interactions and the world that they're in and the world they create. And so it's a kind of a kid's novel. It's like I have 2 books about a little boy named Marco, who's a little city kid, and essentially Marco, I can see him, and it's like he says, "Hi, I'm Marco, and this happened to me, and when I was a little kid, I had a Superman cape," and he just talks to you. Whereas what I'm doing with in their houses is more things at once. It's not just simply a person talking.
Layering,
yeah,
right. Of things. You think Marco's going to come back and tell you another story?
I'd love him to. I once went to visit one of the schools in the South Orange Maplewood district once, and with Marco. And well, the first thing that happened was I walked in, and the kids were horrified. They were little kids. They were second graders, and when they saw me, and I said, "What's the matter?" And they said, "You're not Marco."
Aww.
And they were, you know, not so, well, at least this one kid. That was not all of them. Not a sophisticated reader. He thought it was going to be a kid his age, you know. And I think it may have been that same little boy who said, "Are you going to write another Marco book?" And I said, "I might." And he said, "How about Marco goes to prison?" So I thought, well, that would be interesting, but not the kind of thing I could do, because I have to do things that I have some first-hand knowledge of. You know, I can do some pretty brutal things, but they have to come from me. You know, I can't do something I've never been. So. You're still thinking about the kid who wants the book about Marco in prison.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, does writing, which group of people, that's probably not fair to ask, but I assume you like working with all of them, teachers and students, and you do adult workshops for adults too.
Sure.
But which just really is the closest to your heart?
Oh.
Or all of them?
Well, the variety is really closest to my heart. I do get tired of talking about writing, and one of the things about talking with kids is they don't really care whether, they only care if it's interesting. They don't care if we're talking about a book I wrote or if we're talking about pizza for lunch. They want it to be interesting. So so sometimes it's fun just to be with people that don't particularly want to talk about writing. On the other hand, I really adore teaching adults my novel writing class, because I learn so much every time for myself, and I really like their novels. They're writing really interesting novels. But that's true of children too. Any kind of teaching, it's really insights into people, you know, and I use it when I can.
Well, do you feel like also talking about reading, so when you're talking to somebody about something you've read, and we're almost out of time, so I'll talk really fast, just talking about reading inspire people to write? I would guess with kids that it really does. Even though it's you that showed up and not Marco, but that idea that this person created Marco.
Right, and actually I almost always mix in some writing with talking to them. So I ask them to do something similar. I'll ask them, for example, did you ever imagine you could do something magical when you were 3 or 4? Because Marco imagined he could fly. He's like an 8-year-old, and he says, when I was 3, I thought I could fly. So, and they all do. They said, oh, I could walk through walls. I used to fly. I could see, and I could see through things. And then I have them write about that. And it's just and I've always felt that, okay, here's my theory about writing.
All right, it's got to be really fast, we're out of time.
No one will ever write anything better than the best thing they read.
Oh, that's cool. And
Short,
your
too.
superpower is both reading and writing, therefore. Thank you so much. We're done.